with the National Bureau of Statistics, the NBS, planning to rebase Nigeria's gross domestic product, that's the GDP, and the consumer price index, CPI, expectations are that the economy will be bigger while inflation will be lower. Well, this was the situation in 2014 when Nigeria became Africa's largest economy, with its GDP surging by 89% to $510 billion and inflation averaging 8.05% compared to 8.5% in the previous year. But the NBS, at the Rebasing Sensitization Workshop it organized in collaboration with the Nigerian Economics Summit Group in Lagos last Thursday, emphasized that the exercise does not necessarily mean that the GDP will become more robust or shrink. Rather, it would give an accurate assessment of the economy. Now, according to the NBS, rebasing is a process of updating an old base year with a recent one to reflect changes in the prices of goods and services produced within the economy. The agency explained that constant price estimates are recalculated using the new base year's prices. The rebasing aims to align economic statistics with current realities and account for structural changes in Nigeria's economy. So joining us to discuss if this will be a game changer in Nigeria's economy is Esili Eigbe, a director at Escap Management. Good morning and welcome to the program today.
Good morning.
Good morning.
To see you all.
Happy New Year. Good to see you. First time in 2025.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
Yeah.
All right, let's get straight into it. This is generating a lot of conversation, but of course, rebasing GDP is an exercise that's done in all economies. It's an important exercise to balance out your statistics. So the argument is that 2019 is being used as the base year because that's the last year there was a national standard living survey. I believe they're also saying that 2019 is the last, the more stable year where digital activities were included and a number of other activities. What are your thoughts about the timing around choosing to rebase, as people are saying it's a propaganda move, and what do you think the expected outcome would be of rebasing?
So I think in sense of the timing, obviously comes across as suspicious, but I don't think that we need that level of controversies surrounding the rebase. As you already pointed out, it's sort of part of standard business as far as sort of the statistical agencies of countries are concerned. In fact, the U.S. is expected to also rebase their GDP this year. In 2014, all the countries in the Eurozone did the same thing, So these are pretty standard things happening. The point, as I think you highlighted, is that they're trying to include a number of sectors of the economy that haven't been fully captured. Take mining, for example. Mining, if you look at the figures that's been recorded historically, I'll say what's really happening on the ground is nowhere close to what's on record, okay? But the specific tech sectors they're looking to target here are digital economy. I mean, there's a lot that's happened since 2018 when perhaps that revolution started, okay? You have activities, for example, in the pension industry, the national health insurance, and they've also talked about including illegal activities as well, which was part of what the UK did, I believe, in 2014. The UK included illegal activities in their GDP. So I think that we don't need that level of controversy. They did this 10 years ago. It's about time that they did it again. Okay?
All right, okay, I hear it's about time. And as Vimbai had said earlier on in her introduction, what would likely be the outcome would be, we'll see higher GDP growth, we'll see inflation numbers.
Not higher GDP growth. You see an increase in the GDP. It's not going to get you to number one in Africa.
No, not number one, but at least you would see a positive movement in the GDP.
Yes.
Inflation numbers might potentially.
I know we like to carry first all the time, but it's not going to happen.
I think they are aiming for first. They are the one who is saying that it's you that if you ask the government, they probably want the first position.
It's very unlikely.
Well, it's very unlikely. But let me ask now, what is most important to people is what is the significance of this to the everyday man in Nigeria? How does that impact the inequality index, for instance? Because at the end of the day, we can have these numbers come out, but if we don't see real impact, then to what extent or to what significance is it just for us to have, is the optics being nice and good for the government?
That's a very good question.
What
I think the government should take out of this is that it should basically cast a spotlight on some of the sectors. So digital economy, how do we expand this? And this is it's significant in the sense that everybody in some way or form playing digital economy. A lot of people want to be involved in social media, they're making money off social media, etc. These are relatively small businesses. how do you encourage those businesses to grow? Are there ways you can perhaps, incorporate tax incentives for, doing such businesses? Are there perhaps infrastructure that's necessary, broadband, fiber optics, et cetera? Some of the things that, the Minister for Communications have talked about, I think that those are ways you can address that. In real estate, for example, where they're looking to, I believe, double that to close to 10%, as a contribution to GDP. How do you stimulate activity in the real estate industry? It's been fairly resilient, yeah, but how do you make it stronger? Can you incorporate tax incentives for individuals or corporates who are investing in property? Can you perhaps, take out the bottlenecks associated with, registering title, getting approvals on building plans, et cetera. So that I think is what's important as far as this rebase is important, okay? From an international investor point of view, it obviously, again, casts light on activities or reforms happening in Nigeria, but I don't think that we've seen enough yet on the reform side to perhaps get those internationals looking very seriously at Nigeria. But I think at the very least, we are starting to have perhaps a 2025 that could serve as a relatively stable base year for investors to perhaps begin looking at Nigeria seriously in 2026.
All right.
Okay, but in doing so, there's criticism in the process that we're following. Of course, rebasing comes from the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics. However, we've seen the presidency, through the budget, express their desire for a 15% inflation rate, which of course we know it doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. That is the work of the central bank. And we haven't heard from the central bank yet. I think they're yet to have their first MPC of the year. But my question to you is, all these kind of conversations, don't they begin to question the independence of the central bank when you now have a president declaring that we expect 15%, and you now have the Bureau of Statistics seeming to be moving things to make that happen? But the monetary tools have not told us what their plans are for this economy. So it almost seems like Yemi Cardoso has no choice but to come out and say, our new inflation target is 15%. That takes away his independence. What's your thought on that?
I'm not aware that he's declared that. That would be pretty much impossible. I know that I know the government is targeting 15% at the end of the year, but we know that's impossible, given some of the challenges that we already have. Inflation that printed yesterday, for example, was about 34.8. Hopefully that's the peak for us over the next couple of months. I think that what inflation was reacting to was, the increase in fuel prices sort of still trickling through the economy. But I think I saw that number as a bit of a positive because it indicated that month on month, there was a deceleration, and then we can expect that in January, for example. But to your point, and I've one of your colleagues had challenged me with a similar question, and I think my answer would be, I do wonder and question if there's any economist in the room when they're having these conversations and making some of these forecasts, because I think if you sat down with a spreadsheet and forecasting what sort of, I guess, expected GDP, CPI numbers, you plug that in, there's no way you get a 15%, unless you're really, really optimistic, right? But again, not possible because we have an environment where the government is looking to increase its spend by 40% year on year. That's inflation right there, okay? That's inflation. So I don't see how 15% is realistic. What I've been disappointed about in the last couple of months is that we've had 2 inflation reports and the central bank has not met. One in November, there was one that was announced for December and another one for November, correct. Okay. So I would have expected that they should have met. There's nothing stopping the central bank's MPC from meeting 18 times a year, okay? What the law says is that you have to meet for a minimum of 4 times a year, okay? So I would have thought that in an environment where you have very high inflation, you should be meeting a lot more often. Yeah, the FOMC, for example, in 2024 met about 8 times.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Still on that, what are your projections for the next MPC meeting? I believe it's in February.
It's in February.
It's in February. Yeah. What are your projections, especially in light of the inflation numbers that have come out yesterday from NBS? I know you're saying that it's not too bad, but it's quite bad. It's 34.08%. The major drivers of this remain food and beverages, power, housing, water, electricity, gas, transportation. And what can be said is that these inflationary pressures can be contained by a good fiscal policy. When we talk about food, we talk about beverage, we look at the fact that we've had a number of policy announcements by the government which haven't been followed through, some of them, especially in the area of food and bringing down the cost of food. But we haven't seen that translate to real price differences in terms of the cost of food. It's still high. These are what people will call easy wins, things that can be easily done. How can we begin to address these issues? Because we talk about inflation. On the monetary side of things, they keep raising the basis points. They're trying to tame inflation. But on the fiscal side of things, it doesn't look like there's a corresponding action in that. What can we begin to do with regards to that? If we can tackle food, energy prices, and that's why we keep going back to the two major reforms or policy directions by this administration, which a number of people have said plunge us into the level of inflation that we experience today. How do we begin to manage this?
So I think to your point, if the government can manage to pull off, that there was an initiative to remove VAT and import duties on certain imported goods, including sugar and couple of grains.
Yes.
That hasn't really materialized.
A lot of the waivers haven't been implemented.
Yes, and that was very disappointing because it could have really helped. But it wasn't a surprise because, we did anticipate, I did anticipate that, there'll be challenges in execution. So I think if we can go back to that, it will be a significant relief to, I'm sure they're thinking about it, but as you know, execution with this particular administration has been very difficult. And that's not to say they haven't had some wins. They've had some wins as well, okay? But we'd like to
What are those wins? Because, let's give Nigerians
I'll come back to
hope.
that in a second.
Okay.
But, to your point, just speaking around sort of coordination of efforts, on the fiscal side and the monetary policy side, it'll be nice to see a lot of that. But I already highlighted that, look, you have government spending up some 40% year on year. There are only a few countries that are raising their government expenditure by 40% this year. They're not more than 5. Okay? If I had to quote Milton Friedman, it says there's no such thing as an unbalanced budget.
Absolutely.
You pay for it. The man on the street pays for it in the form of inflation.
Absolutely.
So that's the biggest risk to inflation at the moment. But I'm hoping that the central bank, perhaps being as hawkish as it has been, will remain that way, and they need to keep raising interest rates, I'm afraid. They will have to keep raising interest rates because it's a way to anchor it. I know you like to say that it's been anchored. No, it's in the present. We're still anchoring inflation, okay? And so in the meeting in February, given that they haven't met at least twice since we've had two inflation reports, I'd like to see at least 50 basis points increase in interest rates.
I thought the CBN governor said that we'll begin to see the impact of increases in the first few months of 2025. And we've talked a lot about the impact on, especially small businesses, impact on productivity. Is that still a trade-off we're willing to have to tame inflation? Because
can you reconcile that? We're at a stage today where inflation is at its highest in decades. Okay? So how credible is that?
All right, so talk about the positives. You shared that there were some positives because we've talked about, because you haven't still, I don't think you've answered my question yet around the food, some of the measures that can be taken to reduce food prices. I know you talked about the
I think they need to go back to those, the tariff removals, the import duty removals. How can we execute this? How can we make it work? We can't just open it up to our bodies alone, Everybody who's involved in the business, corporates, individuals that are in that line of business of importing, grains, sugar, etc. Let's open it up. There's so many things we can talk about that have just been really difficult. Take, for example, I know that on paper, you can import things like EVs, and inverters, the batteries, etc. But when you're at the port, it's a different story. So to your question around some of the positives that we're seeing, I'm really encouraged by some of the trends we're seeing in the oil and gas sector, where we've seen massive reforms, by the way. I think you have to give them some credit. There was a special team involved in sort of trying to get there, and that has translated into significant increases in oil output. I mean, Nigeria is currently producing about roughly 1.8, which includes condensates. But on top of that, you're seeing investments going into the sector. Shell and Total have announced FIDs of about $5 billion and about $1 billion respectively, and there's a lot of activity that's actually going on there that I think would obviously help to propel both government revenue, forex earnings, and also create jobs, etc. But that's just one sector. What I'd like to see is a lot of the type of initiatives we've seen in the oil and gas industry brought into other sectors as well. You can give tax incentives across board to stimulate activity, that would obviously create jobs, get people active and spending money, consumption, etc. All that obviously goes back into that vicious cycle of growing the Nigerian economy. Okay.
One of the biggest conversations.
I'll also add, if you don't mind, that we're seeing something that we haven't actually seen in decades. Okay, we're having actually a strong trade surplus. Okay, the trade surplus for 2024 will be about almost 5 times the cumulative, I'll say, surplus we've had over the prior 5 years. Okay, that is significant, and that's a result of a significant increase in export volumes, not necessarily, the value in, say, because of the devaluation of the currency. No, there's actually a significant increase in the volumes. At the same time, we've seen a drop in imports. Imports have dropped by some almost 19%, 20%, whilst export has been broadly flat.
It's a catch-22 because the exchange rate is brutal. So a lot of people who used to import are no longer able to do so. So yes, and this leads me to my next question, which is that often a lot of these metrics, economic metrics, end up being vanity metrics, right? They look good on paper, you do all your nice calculations, you have all your equations, and on paper you have these numbers that, like we're saying with the trade surplus, it's a catch-22, whether we say that's a win or a loss.
It's not just on paper. I'm sorry to cut in. It's just that it takes time to trickle in. Sadly, they haven't had a properly articulated strategy to really addressing economic challenges. I believe you already pointed that. If it was well articulated, we'll be seeing a lot more impact. And you can take Argentina as an example. Javier Milei was just been in power for just about a year, but they've witnessed quite a significant increase and improvement in the economy. Inflation has come down from its highs of plus of 200%. You're seeing a surplus in sort of government spending. You've seen a balance at least.
But he's also borrowing from China to pay his IMF debts. But what I'm trying to say is that can we really celebrate a trade surplus if it's largely as a result of your people losing purchasing power? Is that a win?
Yes, it's a win because, hold on, it's a win in the sense that your sort of local consumption base is cutting back on consumption that perhaps wasn't necessary. Champagne, a lot of the expensive stuff that we were used to consuming, but the basic commodities or staples are still seeing relative increase in consumption, okay? So to give you a good example, one of the biggest areas where we've seen a decline in imports is petroleum products. Mm-hmm. It's petroleum products. Yeah. We're consuming less petroleum. That's a good thing. Mm-hmm. That's a good thing. And perhaps some of the other imports that, perhaps vanity, that we're no longer importing. But I just want to make one last point on the issue of the trade surplus. Okay, the reason why you don't see that, because it's actually significant. We're talking about something probably around $14, $15 billion in trade surplus, which I think is significant. Okay, given at least our history. The reason why you don't see it is because you're still seeing significant capital flight, and that's why it's important for the central bank to keep raising rates. So they kind of have to work together. And you obviously have the fact that we're paying so much in servicing our debt, again, adding to the capital flight issue. And so that's not allowing the impact of that trade surplus to impact the reserves, the foreign reserves. That should ordinarily be helping to accrete the foreign reserves.
Okay. To my actual question, which was around vanity metrics, do you trust our statistics? Do you think our statistics are 100% authentic, even though we have not had a census in over a decade? We have not had a number of the business surveys that need to be done for us to come up with accurate figures for our GDP, even for our CPI. That's why we're having to rebase. Do you trust the numbers?
They're never accurate, not in any economy, to be honest with you. I mean, Nigeria is supposed to be like a $200 billion economy as of 2024. Does it look or feel like a $200 billion economy?
Well, I don't know.
Feels to me like it's closer to $500 billion. That's my point. So, I mean, there's clearly, and this is normal, and I believe that that's what the MBS is trying to do. I understand your concerns around perhaps the credibility of data coming from the MBS. I also share the same concerns. And perhaps I would sound this as a bit of caution to the MBS. Whatever is happening with the rebase of the GDP, the CPI, I think it's in their interest to make sure that it's as credible as they can have it. They're working with a number of donor countries, international organizations like the IMF. So if they do anything to discredit, their, the credibility of the data that comes out from the MBS, I think that they'll be walking a very dangerous line, because we've been there before. There was a time when the central bank itself couldn't rely on MBS numbers, and then had to begin conducting its own inflation or CPI sort of data. So I want to believe they're very aware of that. And they know that credibility is very important as far as data.
You don't sound very convinced.
I don't?
You don't sound very convinced, but let's move on in terms of the credibility of the data. Because only recently we talked about the data released by because they're under a lot of pressure, released by NBS on the security.
This is true. I've been told that's been taken down from the website. It's been taken down.
First of all, the website was unavailable for a few days.
A month.
No, yeah, every month.
A month.
And then now it's back up, and some critical information is missing from the data. So it's, again, very important point with regards to the credibility of the data and this thing about this concentration on optics and people accusing the government of propaganda. But let me ask, still going back to the real impact of the GDP rebasing, what is the impact, or what could potentially be the impact on unemployment numbers? Or what has been the impact on unemployment numbers? Remember that even the basket for that was changed. The numbers are now we're at under 10% unemployment rate. Yeah. But what would be the impact on unemployment? Because these are the real issues. It's not just about giving us figures and numbers. So as I pointed out to you before we started the show,
impact. None of these changes impact the man on the street. So come the announcement day when it's announced, it doesn't change that guy's position.
So what would change them? Because that's the most important thing.
That was what I was addressing. I said, what the government needs to do is put a spotlight on a lot of those sectors, that they haven't given any support to. Property. How do you support? Property is a very relatively big sector in a lot of emerging markets. And I believe that that's why you're seeing the upward revision that the MBS is trying to make. It's valid, actually. So how do you use property as a catalyst for consumption in households, creating jobs, etc.? That's why I'm saying introduce tax relief. If you for example, decide that you want to build, a block of commercial buildings, right? Why can't you get tax reliefs on that? You just offset it with your taxes, and that would be a good incentive for you to perhaps recycle whatever you gain from that building, your rent, etc., into perhaps putting up another building. Okay, the same should apply to corporates as well. And we can also talk about digital economy. How do we encourage a lot of those guys who are currently making money off social media?
All right.
Rather than persecuting them as we do, how do we incentivize them and encourage them to grow? There are a lot of people today using social media to earn dollars. How do we encourage that and grow it?
Absolutely.
That's how you make an impact based on the changes that the MBS is making on the GDP numbers.
Well, thank you very much, Esili Eigbe. Thank you for your time with us this morning.